Well, welcome back from lunch. I've lectured for maybe 30, 40 years, maybe longer. And you know the slots I hate? Right before lunch, because they want to go, and right after, because they want to go to sleep. So I will be raising my voice occasionally just to wake the ones up if I see some of this stuff going on. This has been a talk in progress for some time, and I've been revising it. I literally revised it an hour or two ago based on something that happened in a prior talk. Every time somebody said something that motivated me, I made a slight change. Most of it's just what I'm saying. The slides, I think, are going to be in sync. I believe we're okay in that regard. So hopefully that will work out well. As it was said, this is about a 50-year journey we're going to be describing here. I ain't going to do that in 20 minutes. What I'll do is I'll try to outline kind of a framework, an explanatory framework. And my goal, of course, is to do something that's almost impossible. In fact, most speakers in this conference, and many other speakers and others I've gone to over the decades, basically say, well, this is what we did. No clue what it is, but that's what it is. And my job is to try to figure out, give you some information that might help you understand how this might work. So we're going to be drawing from physics. We're going to be drawing from some rather lateral thinking. And that what we're going to be hearing is actually a work product that relates, believe it or not, to consilience. Okay. Now, as I said, I went to the Muir Woods, like I said, and these ideas that nature is inherently simple and elegant, and that we actually distort nature, but we complexify it in our ignorance, which is kind of a weird thing to think, but we do. Ignorance, it turns out, by the way, is a big reason we don't get it right. We're going to see a number of examples of this. We don't realize how ignorant we are as a species, although nature tells us if we simply pay attention to nature. And so what I would like to do here then is to begin with this model of reality, kind of progress through it in pieces, if I may. One of the things that I've always wondered is, where do ideas come from? We say, I thought that. Philosopher says, if I think this, then it makes a long, convoluted argument. I always like to nail them with, but where does the thought come from? Really, where does it come from? Now, the easy answer, of course, is consciousness, the soundbite answer, which explains, of course, nothing. So that's part of our problem, is it not? So, as of the 20th century, though, our physics has kind of changed. The classical physics of Newton, which led to Einstein's relativity theories, of course, comes along, we're well and good, and then quantum theory hits. And quantum theory is different. It's like it's describing a different world. Maybe it is sitting in a different world. We talked about the quantum realm, did we not? We see these changes. It's like the quantum world is more fundamental than the classical world. May produce the classical world, in fact. This seems to be reasonable. So if the classical universe may emerge from this reality, maybe we should be paying attention to that. Maybe we're talking about a large physical reality in which there are subsets of physical reality. In other words, our physical laws that we know and trust sit in the universe that materializes. And beyond that universe, perhaps beyond an interface of some kind, is a non-material reality with its own set of physical laws. And there's no reason to believe those laws are that related, one to the other. That's the first key to everything. That is the first key. So perhaps we can say the universe is indeed produced by this quantum reality, or if you like, that's the tip of the iceberg, let's call it a deep reality. A deep reality. Now, it was interesting to note that Niels Bohr was one of the people who kind of copped onto this whole thing way back in the early 20th century, when he said, about 1930, that the quantum realm, as he knew it, is invisible, inaccessible, unanalyzable, and incomprehensible. He literally says, I don't know, I don't care, the stuff works, we're done. I'm going home, I'm going out to lunch. That's exactly what he said. And I would argue that deep reality has the same features. Deep reality has exactly the same features. We are limited by light speed, by quantum uncertainty, by our own biases. Nature seems to be doing something pretty definitive. And the upshot of the whole thing is that we don't know what we don't know. Which means, by corollary, that nothing or anything is possible or impossible. If you actually think something's impossible, it's probably more of a statement about our ignorance, there is that word again, than our knowledge. Skeptics, take note. You've been notified. So I'm going to claim here that we live in what I'm going to call a produced universe. This is a not-to-scale graphic representation. And you can see we have this deep reality. The little blue dot is the one and only universe we really need. This is a very limited model. No extra universes we don't need and can't justify. And emerging from that deep reality, from a reality blueprint, are events we might call material and mental. Now, I think these are actually one thing that have different behaviors in actual fact, but let's not go there. We don't have that much time. The key part of this is the reality blueprint. I'm going to argue this reality blueprint contains information, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute, because the definition is important, of states of matter and mind. It's loosely translated. Those states are patterns, and they are projected, or they are realized in the produced universe as what we call matter events, mind events, and the things that are happening right now. These are transformed at a deep level of reality, and what distinguishes them, by the way, are the nature of these transforms. And that, in turn, is why things change, because that deep reality is changing. We seem to keep seeking, even in our discussions this morning, for something else beyond what's going on in our universe. This is my proposal of what that something is. And this blueprint's interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but that's the basic idea. These patterns, which are actually information, so when we talk about information, this is what I conceptualize, is producing that universe. What is information? Ironically, it is actually identified by an no longer active entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's archaic. The right definition is archaic. And the definition is from the root of the Latin word informare, to put form into something. According to the Oxford, we don't use that no more, which is ironic because that's the right one. To put form into something. So this is an information process, not in the sense of knowledge, in the sense of creation. And by the way, several scientific philosophers are on board with that idea. Now, this idea of a produced reality is kind of interesting. One of the things it implicates is the concept of causality. A lot of discussion about causality, you may have noticed, yesterday, today. And we all kind of make an assumption about causality. And this is one of the implications of deep reality. I think no one in this room would disagree that this is a valid demonstration of causality. Cause, effect. Ignore this hand, please. For you on the cheap seats, cause, effect, and over there, cause, effect. Nobody disagrees, right? But in the deep reality view, we have this model. Cause, effect. Correlation, not causation. Why? Because all causation is in the deep reality, not in the universe. The universe is not causally closed. Or put more bluntly, for the philosophers in the room, physicalism is wrong in this regard. There is no causal closure, as we normally stated in philosophy. And I just saw Paul Smith smile, and I know I got a question coming, because I know this guy did this one once before. Oh, good, okay. So anyway, so what happens if I take away the cause, which is actually in deep reality hiding? What do I get? Again, ignore the hand. Boop, boop, for you, boop. What have I just explained? Anybody? Dean, you want to try it? Are you here? I've explained MMI, PK, poltergeists, healing. Bill was supposed to be right there. I had a great line for Bill, but we'll have to let it go. The point is, this explains it. It's simple, it's elegant. All we had to do was move causation to deep reality. That's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. This is not rocket science, folks. It doesn't have to be. Other implications or common assumptions we maybe want to revisit, that consciousness creates reality. We've already heard a little bit about that earlier on. Thanks to Garrett for his wonderful explanation. He cut about 5 minutes out of my talk. Thank you so much. And Chalmer's hard problem of consciousness. I'll talk about that too, as advertised. Before I proceed, however, I would like to say one more thing about something that happened this morning. I just saw Roger Nelson. As I said, I revised this thing just before we started. And as I said earlier, I had those feelings in the Muir Woods. And I had a lot of slides I had to pitch out. And one of my quotes, because it happened in the Muir Woods, was from John Muir. Actually, two were from John Muir. And one of those quotes, Roger, was the same one you used about hitching reality. If you don't believe in synchronicities or retrocausality, okay, but kind of pay attention here, folks. This happens to me all the time, so it's not spinning, but I thought I'd share it with you because I thought it kind of interesting. Okay. So if a skeptic says, well, that's all well and good, I mean, you got a cute little idea there, but show me some evidence. Okay, no problemo. How do we violate causal closure? We find uncontroversial a causal anomaly in the known material universe. And thanks to Professor Rupert Sheldrake, in defense of his morphic resonance theory, we got it. The quantum jumping electron in atomic physics, which suggests that deep reality may know something about materialization and dematerialization. The spontaneously crystallizing inorganic compound, known for centuries in chemistry. Spontaneous human thoughts, subjective consciousness, that's a kind of anomaly. And it's uncontroversial because there's no doubt it happens. A bit more controversially, everything we talk about in boundary science. But it's the same basic thing. Now, we didn't talk about one other interpretation of quantum physics this morning. It happens to be my favorite because it's a very good example of production theory, the hypothesis we're talking about. This is a visual representation of what's called the Bohmian interpretation by David Bohm, published in 1952, inspired by Albert Einstein, who hated the Copenhagen for various reasons. And what it basically says is that active global information, that's like the reality blueprint we talked about earlier, produces the content of the material universe, and it's hiding in something called the implicate order in Bohm's terminology. That's my deep reality. So it's a very close mapping. There's some technical differences I won't get into for lack of time, but it's very close to the kind of thing. And there's several, as was said earlier, several theories that are very similar that kind of follow this production hypothesis. So there's quite a bit of work in theoretical physics that follows along these ideas. This is not just my silly idea. By contrast, the Copenhagen interpretation, which has kind of been beat to death already, so I can zip right over this mostly, actually predicts a collapse. Collapse is unique to Copenhagen, I believe. I don't know of any other interpretation that actually talks about a collapse in this way. But the dirty little secret that wasn't mentioned today, earlier, and I want to share with you, because a lot of people don't know this, there is no mathematical support whatsoever in the Copenhagen interpretation for the prediction of the collapse. None. In fact, that's what Bohm found when he did his theory. And what he found out about that missing variable, the so-called quantum potential, informed him for the first time, I think, in the history of science, as to how the collapse works. And guess what, folks? Physicists in the room, listen up. It is an energy momentum transfer event. Energy momentum transfer event. That, to me, is really interesting. It has implications I won't get into here, but the fact that I meet a lot of physicists who seem to have limited knowledge of the Bohmian interpretation tells me maybe that limited knowledge is one of the reasons that some of the ideas coming from Copenhagen have snuck into our vernacular so quickly. I don't buy it for a minute. So the idea then, from von Neumann and others, this idea came along, something non-material must cause the collapse. If you read von Neumann, you will see he talks about non-material effect. Those are the words he writes in his papers and books. He doesn't talk about consciousness. I don't really know who got it first. We like to say Wigner, I may have been Dirac, who knows, Heisenberg, who knows. Somebody said, though, non-material equal consciousness, and from that came the whole thing. It was a bad guess, a very bad guess, because it violates a basic law of physics. Philosophy, sorry, of logic. You explain one unknown with another. The unknown of the collapse is explained with the unknown of first observer's consciousness. So when you hear somebody say, and you've heard it a lot, you may hear it more, consciousness collapses the wave function, observers collapse the wave function, blah, blah, blah. They are really saying something that is not supported mathematically, not having an empirical proof per se, something that's a bad guess, at least in my opinion. So that's the other reason to dislike the Copenhagen. And the fact of the matter is, important to note, all quantum experiments to date that I know of, and experts tell me this is right, all quantum experiments, including the ones that supposedly show that observers collapse the wave function and create reality, are explainable both at least on the Copenhagen and Bohmian equally. You cannot use the two to differentiate between the two. If there's a method of doing it, I don't know about it. There may be some exotic experiments that might, but everybody who looks at the Copenhagen and Bohmian side by side, they find that there's no difference at that point. It's when you start saying what else do they tell us that Bohmian moves ahead, and we don't care about that here really. So I'm going to blast through these. The point I want to make is deep reality hides most of our physics. That's the key point I want to make. Now, how about Chalmer's problem? That's the reason you're here, isn't it? You saw Chalmers' problem in the program, and you said, I'm going to be there. I want to hear the solution to Chalmers' problem, by golly. Well, kind of. There is an issue, though. And cleverly segueing into the theme of the conference, it has to do with consilience. So what's Chalmers actually asking us to do? He's asking us to build a bridge. So that's what his original statement of the hard problem really says. And I'll quote here, between the physics of mass energy on the one hand and the undeniable subjective consciousness or experience of subjective consciousness on the other, end quote, highlights mine. But what he's talking about here is subjective consciousness. He calls the program natural dualism. There is no mention, initially, of idealism or primacy of consciousness. There is no mention of ubiquity of consciousness or panpsychism. That's important, I believe. But has Chalmers unwittingly set a trap for us? Because to build a bridge, you need foundations. It sounds like in material and non-material, deep reality, both ends. We know about material reality enough to probably build the bridge. But do we know enough to build the other end of the bridge? We can't get into deep reality. We have to guess about it. So if we solve the hard problem, we may have a problem here. The bridge may be a bridge to nowhere. In other words, on this view, the problem is insoluble. If we apply standard empiricism, Popperian falsifiability, and things like that. But what if we change our tactics? And this has been alluded to several times in this conference. What if we say, instead of taking our traditional approaches, we use abduction, we use various other forms of understanding? Can we build something useful? Well, the answer is yes. How do I know so well? Why am I not just blowing smoke about this? Because this entire model is an exercise in precisely that. I'm not proposing it, I've already done it. And that's the link to consilience. This whole model, which by the way will be published in some major technical journal, I believe shortly, and I think the book called Phenomenal Lives, which I'm writing right now, I think we may have a publisher, so it'll probably be coming out hopefully toward the end of the year, which is my scientific memoir and contains all this stuff in layman detail. And of course I'm doing videos, because let's face it, nothing exists until it's on the internet, right? Nothing's real, so gotta do those. But the point is, we can fix this by simply using these new tactics, which I've used in this. And one of those new tactics to develop this model called GI3R is essentially to ask a key question that we never, ever ask. I'm about to give you a secret, a very important secret. If you're in research, please listen carefully. There is a secret question. It's almost a mandala. And what it is the word why. Why is anything the way it is? This is so important I've given it a name. I call it the Genesis question, not in the term of creation, but it's a question you ask. When you ask this question, guess what happens? Nature responds. Many of you may know that von Neumann said, what quantum physics is really telling us is how we acquire knowledge, not so much what's out there, but what's in here. This is an exercise in this exact thing, practical exercise. When I started doing this years ago, it was just an intuitive thought, kind of like the I Ching in '64, something deep. I realized that this was actually bringing revelations across, first-class revelations. A lot of the questions were answered in this way. So I trust this a lot, but with a caveat. Those ideas that come up out of the deep reality in nature, on my view, can be lies. What's the evidence? We believed at one time the world was flat. Most of the world believed it. Where did that idea come from? Deep reality. So the scenario is, it's not that deep reality tells you the truth all the time. It will give you a chance if you do it right. Do it wrong, and you'll get a host of lies out of deep reality. Just remember that. I used to think nature would only give me the truth. Of course, that turned out to be totally wrong. So the model is simple and elegant, just like nature, you'll recall, and it's complete. Now, here's the most fantastical claim I'm going to make. It actually explains everything. I have gone to countless, and I mean countless, seminars, read countless papers in all disciplines, thought about this very deeply for 20, 30 years. I held this back, by the way, for 7 years because I was looking for something in science that blew me apart. Haven't found it yet. I was sitting next to Darrell Bem at the 2016 meeting, And as people, I told him a bit about the model, and as people came up, and we got crazier and crazier, and Bengtson's doing about cancer thing, this kind of stuff. All that's going on. After each presentation, I just leaned over to Daryl and I said, got that covered. Got that covered. After 5 or 6 of these, he finally acknowledged, okay, I get it, your model works. But the point is it does. And this is crazy. I mean, I don't believe in it. I never thought I would develop anything like this. Although I may have set an intention way back when I asked the innocent question, I wonder what a model or theory of everything would look like. Never intending to build one, but that may have been the starting point in actual fact. Or maybe on a retrocausal view, that was really the end. And this is closer to the start. After all, in the retrocausal view, the end is the beginning is the end. I'm sounding like an Eastern mystic, I'm going to shut up, but you get the idea. So what does GI3R stand for? It's an acronym. These features is goal-seeking, intention-directed, information-mediated, that's the blueprint part, interaction-driven, that's the transformation part, and retrocausally based. What does it mean to be retrocausally based? This is a really interesting thing to me. It has a lot of implications, and I can only touch the surface. This says that the blueprint, think of a tree laying on its side, grows backward in time from the end of all reality to the beginning, which encompasses, of course, multiple universes. Only one, we don't need multiples. And this trunk branches, and it sets goals during the actual building of the blueprint. Those trigger intentions, which are really system requests to deep reality in actual fact. Humans can set them and others can. If you think about your work, you'll see a lot of places where this model starts to make sense. You say, intention to this, well, we can issue intentions, but so can deep reality. And if you think of an intention, you're not doing it. Deep reality is doing it, linked to goals, which we can't see, and having priorities we don't know about. Again, it's all hidden. This is why we can't do a consistent experiment. The closer we get to the non-material aspects of the whole system, the more unstable it gets from our point of view. The closer we get to the material stuff, those transformations are more stable because those are our physical laws in basis. And so as a result, we see different differential behaviors. When people are talking about, well, even this morning, people were saying, well, it worked under these, but it didn't work under those. I was nodding there saying, yep, that makes sense, that makes sense. Not one thing said in this room has in any way, shape, or form confused me. The model is that clean. It really is. And if you apply it, once you understand more about it, I think you'll agree with me. There's also a universal clock, because check this out. Relativity theory, of course, says there is no privileged reference frame. Every physicist in the room knows that and accepts it, and it's true. You don't need it. In 4D space-time, you don't need it. And as long as you're in the universe, you're cool. But outside the universe, deep reality, that is the privileged reference frame. It has a clock. By the way, if you believe time doesn't exist, you're not here, so don't worry about it. Because you got to be. Time has to exist for stuff to happen in the deep reality. There is a universal clock in deep reality, or there could be, which means everything is being timed. And still be fully relativistic, because if the produced universe is 4D spacetime or 4D spacetime compliant in the transformations, boom, we get relativity for free. Time reality, all that stuff, no problem. So we need to tool up for consilience. We need to embrace introspection and abduction, things like that. We need to consider the Genesis question. This is what I've been doing as I've been developing the model. I'm just telling you what I did. This is not theoretical or woozy-foozy stuff. This is what I've been doing. So what I'm thinking is we need to embrace humility, because, again, we're not that important in the universe. There's a great video on Google. You've probably seen it. If you haven't, check it out. It's a young lady sitting on top of the Google complex in San Francisco. The video pulls out, the simulation pulls out. We see the Googleplex. We see the West Coast in San Francisco. You know what? We've gone out in space. We see the solar system. It makes the point, by the time we get to the edge of the universe, which is, of course, a simulation, we see the point, make the point pretty clearly, you aren't that important, get over yourselves. And there are some issues regarding that. We have a real problems in philosophy and in science, because that's part of the ignorance too. So I'm going to suggest, in addition to striving for what I've tried to do my entire life, be objective, open-minded, critical thinker, but look at all sides of a question, blah, 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 all that good stuff, discard the intellectual baggage. Get rid of anthropocentrism. We don't need it. Are we really the most important thing on the planet? In the universe? Really? Does the mystery, a mystery to us, consciousness, qualify as the basis of reality? Really? I don't think nature would agree with you. not based on our cosmological significance. I don't think so. And of course, as we've seen, idealism and panpsychism is baggage we have to have because we haven't got a better answer. If you accept the possibility that this or something like it, the deep reality model, is the better thing, then should you not discharge idealism, panpsychism, and anthropocentrism? I would say yes. You may disagree, but I would say yes. Now, a very strange thing has happened here. By the way, this is kind of my hero. And he famously said, you know this one, we can't solve our problems the old way. That's kind of the bottom line of the whole, you got to move forward, or it ain't going to happen. Okay? I like the Hawaiian shirt. I think it's cool. So actually, I think we're done. I can't believe it. We are. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I'm John Streiff. Thank you. Thank you. So the questions, Brenda?
Okay, we've got a little more time than usual for questions or comments. Anybody?
My plan was to fill out the things I didn't say. I knew I could trust York. I'm trying to fill it out because I figured you guys would have certain things you'd want to know that I intentionally wouldn't cover due to lack of time.
I'm afraid that I'm not terribly impressed with this discussion of the deep reality model because as you've portrayed it, it seems to explain everything and therefore explain nothing. I mean, I can explain everything equally well by saying that all our experience are due to the 25th century neurobiologists who are maintaining us all as brains in nutrient vats and feeding us the experiences they want us to have.
Yes, I would agree, York. The issue is here there are a number of ways it could be done. In fact, I'll take York one step. I'll see York's comment and up at one. You could also say that we're living in a static universe where everything has already been decided. We don't need this model. There's only one mystery, and it's how in the devil do we get from point A to point B as living organisms with experiences. So yes, the point being, there's a lot of ways of doing it, and I don't think, and this is my point, he hit on a key point, we probably never will know the nature of deep reality or things like it. Now, how would we falsify it? Because that's an obvious question to ask at this point. We'd falsify it by discovering that everything could be explained in 4D spacetime or something like that. That's the perfect falsification. I don't know if the other ideas would falsify the same way, but yes, there is an issue, and I completely agree with that.
Hi there. So I'm obviously haven't wrapped my mind around this, but my initial impression is that you're making you're kind of confounding philosophy and science, and you're making a skeptical argument, philosophically speaking, but you're not necessarily grounding that skeptical argument properly. In other words, there's a much more involved philosophical task to be done here. So for example, as an example,
Yeah.
a possible solution. So it's a Canadian theologian and philosopher, Bernard Lonergan, wrote a massive book like this called Insight, where he tries to ground metaphysics. He says prior to any metaphysics or any kind of worldview that you present, you have to articulate an epistemology, a cognitional theory, and prior to that, you have to articulate like an operational theory, which is like, what am I doing when I come to know anything? So I think, whatever you're doing here, I think there's more work to be done in grounding it in that question. And Lonergan's answer is something to the effect of that there are certain operations that we cannot avoid doing whenever we make any claim. Right, so it's same as the argument against total skepticism, that you're making a positive claim of not knowing anything, for example, right? It's not coherent.
Right, exactly.
So the cognitional theory has to be ultimately articulated, and Lonergan's argument is that it has a certain unavoidable structure to it that involves consciousness. It happens to involve consciousness necessarily, simply because any claim that you're making is a claim coming from a point of consciousness, right? So I just wanted to bring this up as something to think about.
The nature of the model claims that everything you just said originates in the model. every idea, every theme, every archetype, the idea of redness, color, all that. So while I
But that's
completely buy your
tautological.
logic,
You're just proposing a kind of a...
yeah, I provide the logic, and I think in time, people who are much more educated in philosophy than I will probably look at this and tear it apart and say, some will say yes and some will say no. There'll be a lot of polemics that will be generated on this, if anybody, if it picks up, maybe no one will like it. But the point of it is, this is a bootstrap, it's a starting point. It's a way of thinking. The real important deal here is if we get causation out of the universe, and we're willing to accept a deep reality exists, the whole game changes. That's the message I really want to leave with you folks. And I'm hoping that scientists and philosophers, maybe not buying it today, but will actually say to themselves, wait a minute, I remember that silly presentation 5 years ago. I didn't buy any of it, but wait a minute, this actually makes some sense. I want to bootstrap one kid. And if anybody wins a Nobel Prize on the back of any of this, that's more than payback for me. I don't care if you believe it. But in fact, as a truth seeker, you learn. You can't worry about what other people think. You really can't, or else you'll never get anything done. Paul,
So essentially, this talk is an investment in the future. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I'm constantly in touch with my future self, so that's how I work. That's how I roll.
Okay. So the first thing is the causal closure argument. David Streiff talked a bit about that, and
Right.
we're all in agreement on that.
Right.
In fact, implicitly, anybody who believes in the reality of this phenomenon is at least betting that causal closure is false.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I know in your paper you talk about it.
Yeah, there's great arguments against it because it really is just a metaphysical assertion. In a way, it's sort of a tautology. It actually comes to the conclusion that it assumes.
Right.
But a physicalist has to have it, or it doesn't, or physicalism doesn't work.
Right.
But now I'm going to ask a question which may betray my obliviousness or something. So the simplest formulation of David Chalmer's hard problem is that essentially, how does a physical construct like a body experience the things that we experience as conscious experiences, feelings,
Okay.
smells, the experience of the color of your shirt.
This is where it gets
that kind of thing.
interesting. Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. I'm making a claim that's hard to verify, and I know
Well,
that.
no, let me actually.
Okay, good. More
cut that
concrete?
off.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the simplest formulation of it. And it's fairly easy for anybody to understand. How can a body actually have the feeling you get when you see red, right? So I guess what I didn't get was a clear understanding of how you think what you're talking about solves that problem. And that may have been a lack of attention on my part, so maybe this is a stupid
I had to
question.
leave something out.
Okay,
and
so-
it may or may not be satisfactory, but I did leave something out that's critical at this point.
Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and maybe you can
Yeah, yeah.
make me smarter about this.
Well, hopefully it makes sense. The key to the whole thing is that the physics is different than we know. That's the first thing we have to accept. The physics is different than we know. So I believe that what we call matter and mind are manipulations of some proto-substance that is actually the basis of reality, kind of the ground state of everything, like we used to say in the 80s. And these transformations are really manipulating that. That's what mind is. Underneath all of this, to address Paul's direct question, there are archetypes, red colors, structures, emotions, numbers, as in the I Ching. And this is what branches across everything. So the archetype of red, when materialized, or put through the material process, the stuff that turns into matter as we see it, creates a shirt, like this, or a photon that's at the right frequency. And when we put that same archetype through the mental process, we'll call it that for lack of a better term, we get redness, the qualia. In other words, this explains qualia, which is kind of the heart, I think, of what Paul's going for in that question. It's a stretch, but I don't know of a better one. Everything else I've heard is all kind of circular arguments, but and embedded in a lot of academic talk that I can't understand, frankly. And maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe I'm having the same problem you're having, Paul. But I haven't heard a clear explanation of how qualia works from anybody. I also haven't heard a clear explanation from any physicist, despite assurances from people like you, Price, and others. Jack Sarfati hasn't come through to actually explain how a static universe could contain motion. I'd love, if you're a physicist and you think you can explain that in English, please come and see me, because I want to hear the argument, because obviously I'm missing it. But back to Paul's point. It is the nature of the deep reality. It is unlocal, it is very flexible, it breaks most of the, if not all the boundaries we know about, It's just a whole different place. And these archetypes link together. The idea of a surface, for example, manifesting as that, but also manifesting as the concept of linearity, you say. Those archetypes is kind of what we're dealing with here. So that's my brief answer to kind of deal with how to solve, we're approaching it. I'm not saying a pure solution, but I think I'm going in the right direction, and if someone were to follow that, I honestly believe that, with all the comments about how you do it philosophically and all the necessary, checks and balances, dots and crosses, I think that something very interesting could emerge from that. Again, this is the bootstrap. This is the first time out. Never said this to anybody before, and so you're the first audience, and all your comments are valuable. How are we doing on time, Brenda?
We actually have a few minutes left for
Okay.
one or two more questions.
Okay, this is crazy. I really thought I was going to run over.
No, you were
So I'm a little confused with your last explanation because that sounds very much like idealism or Neoplatonism. So you just said you didn't want to resort to idealism or panpsychism, yet in your notion of a latent model, your thing that is latent is some sort of an ideal that you are getting the quality from for the qualia. So
What I
don't-
want to
don't get it.
avoid is using the word consciousness beyond its normal definition. It's a seductive, deceptive term in my opinion. Maybe you don't agree, but I believe it is. It leads to possibly sloppy logic. It can. You can begin conflating things without realizing it. I see that a lot in the writings, especially in philosophy, especially in folks who are promoting idealism, especially. I see that a lot. I think if you take what I've noticed in philosophy, there seem to be various perspectives, and you actually mentioned two right there, on this notion of idealism. So I'm probably going to have to use some idealistic concepts, necessarily, following on what the other gentleman said, in order to explain it. But I don't have to buy into consciousness being fundamental, which is another nature of idealism, in order to go there. And I realize that's contentious. I get that. I get that. If you have a follow-up, yeah, I'd love to hear it. 'Cause this is what I need to hear. I really need to hear this stuff.
I just see what you're saying as a semiotic difference, as a semantic
Could you
difference.
say that a different way, please? I'm not into academic talk. Can you say that in simple words, please?
Yeah, the words you're using have been defined in a different way than the way
Okay.
you're using them for most of us.
Okay.
And so that confuses us. And
Okay,
what
that's
we're
red
seeing
value.
right now is a very Platonic, idealistic notion
Okay.
of how latent variables or hidden variables work in the world. And the way you want to describe them seems different than that. You're not wanting them to be
Okay,
things
fair.
that are just not
Well, I'm fully aware of my
observable, but
limitations
things
regarding
that,
the
that are
language.
self-generating.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of that, and that's a good feedback. Now, see, that helped, because once you put it in simple English for me, it became crystal clear what you were trying to say to me, and I can understand it's very good feedback.
Yeah.
That's part of the problem right there. I asked you to do that because I wanted to demonstrate the problem.
Yeah.
And that's, but I think you're right. I think you're
And I
very
think
right. That's useful.
I'm a cognitive scientist.
Uh-huh.
I have this problem with physicists.
Exactly.
Whose idea of measurement problem is about precision, not about construct validity.
Yeah.
Consilience was going to require a type of construct validation that we've nowhere even near. So measurement issues need reliability, validation, bias,
Right.
need to come on top of us speaking the same language.
Yeah,
We're
and
just
that's really the
not
bottom
there
line.
yet.
We're not there yet, and I agree with you. I think everyone in this room probably agrees with that point. Thank you very much. You're very helpful.
It's quick.
I was going to say we have time for one or two more. So.
I can't believe what I did.
So I'm a physicist who has problems with physicists, and I have a comment that has absolutely nothing to do with you or your talk.
In other words, we have so few questions, we're actually on to Never Never Land, which is
But
wonderful.
it actually does.
You bring it
tie
back? Okay, cool.
But it does tie into the last comment.
Okay.
And that is as an idea, just to get out there for the society when we're thinking about future meetings. One of the themes that's come up in a number of conversations already, both in discussions in presentations and in sidebar discussions, is what language has to offer and the ways that
that's
language can be
valuable.
effective and
I agree.
ineffective. And as an idea or a theme, or in somehow being able to incorporate in future meetings, I would propose that might be a subject that's worth exploring, especially if we're going to follow on and continue to explore the idea of consilience, which I think so many people
Probably
are
will,
agreeing is going to demand that we're much more effective in our language. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really great, and in fact, I didn't put that on my list, but if I thought about it, I would have, because it's a wonderful idea, and I imagine most of us feel the same way. Yeah, thank you very much. Well done.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you so much.
Great.